Welcome to this week's Deep Dive.
We'll be examining a week in October 1939, specifically October 23rd to 29th.
This week offers a window into the dynamics of the early stages of World War II.
We are now just over a month into the war, and during this week, we'll be observing events across multiple fronts.
So we can gain a deeper understanding, I think, of the complexities of wartime diplomacy.
The increasing impact of naval warfare.
And the very beginnings of the horrors that would come to define this conflict.
We're going to examine these events chronologically, day by day.
Starting with Monday, October 23, 1939.
While much of Europe was anticipating a large-scale conflict on the Western Front, the reality was a period of relative inactivity.
Right. This was the beginning of what would be known as the phony war.
This term, phony war, really reflects the sentiment at the time that large-scale fighting was unlikely until the spring.
Because many believed that the heavy rains and the approaching winter would hinder any kind of offensive.
That's right.
Despite this perceived quiet, the Germans did conduct minor attacks along the Saar front to test the French defenses.
These actions served as a reminder that although major battles were yet to be fought, the war was not over.
Meanwhile, in the north, tensions were brewing between Finland and the Soviet Union.
The Soviets were demanding territorial concessions from Finland, and this raised concerns in Finland regarding their sovereignty and security.
Right. This seemingly isolated dispute would soon develop into a full-blown conflict.
The Winter War.
Yes.
And the Winter War would demonstrate the expanding reach of World War II and would be a critical turning point in the early stages of the conflict.
With significant implications for both Finland and the Soviet Union.
Absolutely.
Now, shifting our focus to the Atlantic Ocean, we see the early stages of what would become the Battle of the Atlantic.
Yes, and one particular incident that stands out is the capture of the American freighter, the City of Flint, by the German cruiser Deutschland.
The City of Flint was carrying cargo to Britain when it was seized by the Germans, and then the ship was taken to the Soviet port of Murmansk.
This presented a challenge to the Soviets, who were attempting to remain neutral while also honoring their pact with Germany.
So initially, the Soviets detained the German prize crew and returned the City of Flint to its American captain.
However, after pressure from Berlin, the Soviets reversed their decision. The ship was detained, and the situation became a complex diplomatic affair.
This incident highlights the difficulties of remaining neutral during a global conflict.
Absolutely.
It also shows how the impact of the war reached far beyond the main theaters of conflict.
And that is further exemplified by public opinion in the United States at the time.
Right.
A Gallup poll conducted that week revealed that 84% of Americans supported an Allied victory.
However, at this point, most Americans still favored providing material support to the Allies rather than direct military intervention.
Moving on to Tuesday, October 24th. We continued to observe the events of the Battle of the Atlantic. The German submarine U-37, commanded by Korvettenkapitän Werner Hartmann, was operating west of Gibraltar. The submarine sank 3 British freighters, the Ledbury, the Menin Ridge, and the Tafna.
Okay.
All 3 were sailing unescorted, making them easy targets for the U-boat.
This incident, I think, further emphasizes the growing threat German submarines pose to Allied shipping.
That same day, the Emmy Friedrich, a German tanker, was intercepted by British and Canadian naval forces in the Yucatan Channel.
Right.
To avoid capture, the crew scuttled the vessel.
Wow.
This act of self-destruction shows the commitment on both sides to control the seas.
Absolutely.
Back in Europe, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop gave a speech in Danzig.
And in his speech, he blamed Britain for the war and accused them of years of hostility towards Germany.
The British government dismissed his speech as an attempt to create discord among the Allies. Meanwhile, Germany and the Soviet Union were finalizing a trade agreement in Berlin. The Soviets agreed to provide Germany with 1 million tons of grain and fodder.
Wow.
This pact further solidified the alliance that had been established by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
In occupied Poland, the Polish government in exile, now operating from Paris, managed to move a substantial amount of their gold reserves out of the country.
This ensured the continuation of the Polish government and its ability to support resistance efforts.
This was a crucial victory for the Polish government in exile.
Moving on to Wednesday, October 25th, we continue to see activity at sea.
Right.
The German submarine U-16 ran aground on the Goodwin Sands in the Strait of Dover.
Okay.
The entire crew was lost. This was a significant setback for the German U-boat force.
And in response to the incident, Admiral Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat force, prohibited U-boats from operating in the Strait of Dover.
This required them to take the longer route around Scotland, impacting their operations.
Right.
However, off the coast of French West Africa, French naval forces achieved a victory.
Okay.
They captured the German freighter Santa Fe.
This disrupted German maritime logistics.
This highlights the contribution of French naval forces to the Allied war effort.
Meanwhile, in occupied Poland, the Nazi regime was implementing increasingly discriminatory policies against the Jewish population.
In Wukowek, Nazi authorities ordered the Jewish population to wear yellow badges.
This was one of the earliest occurrences of this measure in occupied territories.
Right.
This seemingly small step marked the beginning of a systematic campaign of dehumanization and persecution against the Jews under Nazi rule.
Yes.
The yellow badges isolated and stigmatized Jews, making them easier targets for discrimination and violence.
In Germany, Hitler met with his military leaders.
During the meeting, they set a tentative date for the invasion of France, codenamed Fallgeld.
Okay.
The chosen date was November 12th, although various factors would lead to its postponement.
Right.
This meeting revealed that the Nazi regime was focused on expanding the war westward and planning for a major offensive against France and the Low Countries. On Thursday, October 26th, we observed the Nazi regime further consolidating its control over occupied Poland.
Hans Frank was officially installed as Governor General of the General Government, the administrative unit established by Nazi Germany to oversee occupied Poland.
Okay.
Frank, a key figure in the Nazi regime, would oversee the implementation of brutal policies in Poland.
Right.
This included the persecution of Jews and the exploitation of Polish resources.
In Slovakia, Józef Tiso was formally declared the first president, cementing the alignment of Slovakia with Nazi Germany.
Tiso's regime would quickly implement discriminatory policies against Jews and other minorities, mirroring the Nazi ideology.
Right.
Slovakia's alignment with the Axis powers further strengthened German influence in Central Europe.
In the Atlantic, the wreck of the German submarine U-16 lost earlier in the week was discovered on the Goodwin Sands.
All 50 crew members perished.
In Britain, the Auxiliary Military Pioneer Corps was established.
This corps, composed of volunteers, would go on to play a crucial role in constructing defenses and supporting the war effort.
On Friday, October 27th, Pope Pius XII issued his first encyclical, Summi Pontificatus.
The document condemned totalitarian ideologies and expressed compassion for displaced Poles.
Right.
While he did not directly name Germany, the encyclical was interpreted as criticism of the Nazi regime.
In the United States, the Senate passed a bill amending neutrality laws.
The bill allowed for the sale of arms to belligerent nations under a cash-and-carry policy. This marked a shift in U.S. policy towards supporting the Allies while still maintaining formal neutrality.
Meanwhile, the situation with the City of Flint continued to evolve.
The Soviets returned the captured American freighter to its German prize crew.
Okay.
They did, however, detain the American captain.
Wow.
This further complicated the diplomatic situation.
In Germany, Hitler met with his military leaders to discuss concerns regarding the preparedness of German forces for an offensive on the Western Front.
Despite worsening weather conditions, Hitler was determined to push forward with his plans for an invasion of France and the Low Countries.
On Saturday, October 28th, the Nazi regime continued to strengthen its control over occupied Poland.
In Wukowek, Jewish males between the ages of 14 and 60 were ordered to perform forced labor,
adding to the hardship already being faced by the Jewish community.
The forced labor was part of a larger effort to exploit and dehumanize the Jewish population.
In a further escalation of anti-Semitic policies, Jewish residents of Wukowek were also ordered to wear Yellow Star of David badges.
This visible marker of discrimination further isolated and stigmatized the Jewish community, making them easier targets for persecution.
In occupied Czechoslovakia, thousands of Czechs, mainly students, gathered in Prague to protest against German rule.
This demonstration coincided with the 21st anniversary of Czechoslovakia's independence.
Right.
The protests were met with brutal repression by Nazi authorities. Mass arrests were ordered, universities were closed, and several student leaders were executed.
In Germany, Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS, issued a secret directive to the SS, known as the Lebensborn Dekret.
This order encouraged SS officers to father children with women of good blood, even outside of marriage.
Right.
This program was designed to create a master race for the Nazi regime.
In the Atlantic, the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee refueled from the tanker Altmark near Tristan da Cunha.
The Admiral Graf Spee had been attacking Allied shipping in the South Atlantic, disrupting British supply lines.
In Finland, negotiations with the Soviet Union over territorial demands continued, but no progress was made.
The Soviets maintained their demand for concessions from Finland.
And this lack of progress increased the probability of war between Finland and the Soviet Union.
In Britain, the RAF shot down its first Luftwaffe aircraft over British soil.
Okay.
A Heinkel He-111 bomber was shot down near Humby, Scotland.
Uh-huh.
2 crew members survived and were taken prisoner.
Right.
This event, which came to be known as the Humby Heinkel, marked a change in the air war over Britain.
The incident demonstrated that the RAF was capable of defending British airspace against German incursion.
In the United States, the State Department submitted a formal protest to the Soviet government regarding the handling of the City of Flint incident.
Right.
The protest conveyed the concern over the detention of the American captain and crew. It emphasized the importance of adhering to international maritime law.
Finally, on Sunday, October 29th, Hitler moved his command post to Godesberg, Germany.
This move signified his focus on the Western Front.
Right.
The Wehrmacht continued their planning for Fall Gelb, the invasion of France and the Low Countries.
Discussions began to lean toward a bold strategy.
This strategy would focus on a thrust through the Ardennes forest.
The Battle of the Atlantic persisted, with the German submarine U-34 sinking the British merchant vessel Malabar south of Land's End, England.
5 lives were lost.
Yeah.
However, 70 survivors, including the convoy commodore, escaped in lifeboats and were rescued by HMS Grafton.
This incident shows the constant danger German U-boats pose to Allied shipping.
The Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, made the decision to authorize attacks on passenger liners traveling in Allied convoys.
Wow.
This decision signified a shift towards unrestricted submarine warfare.
Right.
It also increased the risk to civilian passengers and intensified the conflict at sea.
In occupied Poland, the Nazi regime carried on with their policies designed to exploit and control the Polish population.
Hans Frank, the Governor-General of the General Government, announced new measures to enforce forced labor for Polish men between the ages of 14 and 60.
Right.
This decree increased the exploitation of Polish labor, forcing them to support the German war effort.
Escalating the anti-Semitic measures already in place, Jewish residents of Wukowak were ordered to wear yellow Star of David badges on their clothing.
This further isolated and dehumanized the Jewish population, making them more susceptible to persecution and violence.
In occupied Czechoslovakia, German authorities continued their crackdown on dissent following the protests of the previous day.
The Gestapo conducted widespread arrests of students, intellectuals, and anyone suspected of dissent.
Right.
Surveillance increased throughout Prague, creating an environment of fear and repression.
In Latvia, Soviet troops began occupying bases across the country.
This was in accordance with the Soviet-Latvian Pact.
You're right.
This action signified a step toward the Soviet Union's annexation of the Baltic states.
The annexation would be finalized the following year and would bring Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania under Soviet control.
In Italy, the new town of Pomezia was inaugurated.
Okay.
Built on reclaimed land from the Pontine Marshes near Rome, this town was a demonstration of fascist urban planning.
Right.
This symbolized Mussolini's goal to transform Italy into a modern, self-sufficient nation.
Switzerland held federal elections, which resulted in a victory for the Free Democratic Party.
This reflected Switzerland's ongoing commitment to neutrality and domestic stability amidst the growing turmoil in Europe.
Back in Britain, the RAF had another victory in the air war.
They shot down a Heinkel He-111 bomber near Haddington, Scotland.
Okay.
This was the second German aircraft to be shot down over British soil.
This incident further boosted morale and demonstrated the RAF's increasing effectiveness in defending British airspace.
Finally, in China, Japanese forces continued their attack on Lanzhou.
They were met with fierce resistance from Chinese defenders.
The battle for Lanzhou highlights the ongoing conflict in Asia.
The strength of the Chinese forces in the face of constant Japanese attacks demonstrates their commitment to defending their nation.
Absolutely. Looking back at this week in October 1939, it really gives us an early look at the unfolding of the Holocaust.
Yes, we can really see that escalation of discrimination and persecution of Jewish people in occupied Poland.
The order requiring Jewish people to wear yellow badges in Wusuk was a calculated step to isolate and dehumanize them.
And although it seemed insignificant at the time, this marked the beginning of a systematic campaign of oppression that would lead to the Holocaust.
Absolutely. It shows how seemingly minor actions can lead to unimaginable atrocities.
Right.
This week's events, I think, emphasize the complex and often morally ambiguous nature of war.
Right.
The City of Flint incident, with its conflicting claims of ownership and the diplomatic balancing act of the Soviet Union, really illustrates the difficulties of remaining neutral during a global conflict.
And it raises questions about international law and the obligations of nations to protect non-combatants.
Yes, absolutely.
The sinking of the Malabar and the authorization of attacks on passenger liners further blurred the distinction between military targets and civilian populations.
Right. These decisions demonstrate the terrible consequences of unrestricted warfare and the erosion of humanitarian principles in the quest for victory.
This week also offers a glimpse into the strategies and motivations of the major powers involved.
I think so.
Hitler's relocation to Godesberg and the continued planning for Fall Gelb reveal the Nazi regime's determination to break the stalemate on the Western Front and expand the war westward.
The Soviet Union's actions in Finland and the Baltic states reveal their opportunistic approach to expanding their territory, exploiting the turmoil of war to further their own interests.
While officially neutral, the United States was slowly moving toward a more active role in supporting the Allies.
Right.
The cash and carry policy was a significant step in that direction. It provided a lifeline to the Allies while allowing the United States to avoid direct military intervention.
Absolutely.
So as we conclude our examination of this week in October 1939, what are your main takeaways?
Well, I think this week really showcases a significant escalation of the conflict across numerous fronts. And it offered, perhaps more importantly, some early indications of the horrors that were yet to come.
The relative inactivity on the Western Front during this period really stands out, I think.
Yes, this period, also known as the Phony War, really highlights the strategic calculations and military buildups that were occurring behind the scenes.
Both sides were preparing for a major confrontation. The timing and nature of that confrontation, however, were still uncertain.
So the Phony War was really a time of preparation and uncertainty, a lull before the storm.
The storm of the German invasion of France in the spring of 1940, of course.
Exactly. But the quiet on the Western Front certainly did not mean there was no fighting elsewhere.
The Battle of the Atlantic was already well underway, and the Nazi regime was tightening its grip on occupied Poland.
Right. Implementing those policies that foreshadowed the Holocaust.
And those early signs of the Holocaust are, I think, quite evident in the events of this week.
Yes, the order for Jews in Wauquiez to wear yellow badges, the forced labor decrees, and the general atmosphere of fear and repression that was directed at the Jewish population in occupied Poland. All deeply troubling.
These actions really foreshadow the systematic persecution and genocide that would follow.
And I think it's important to remember that these early measures were not random acts. They were part of a deliberate and calculated plan by the Nazi regime to isolate and ultimately eliminate the Jewish people from Europe.
So this week in October 1939 really provides a glimpse into the beginnings of the Holocaust.
It's a chilling reminder of how seemingly small steps can result in unimaginable atrocities.
The events of this week also underscore the truly global nature of World War II.
Absolutely. While much of the focus, understandably, was on Europe, the conflict was also raging in Asia.
As we saw with the ongoing battle for Lanzhou in China.
Right. World War II was a truly global conflict with far-reaching consequences for nations and people all over the world.
And that interconnectedness of the various theaters of war is, I think, a really significant takeaway here.
Yes, events in Europe affected events in Asia and vice versa.
The war was a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and ideological clashes, with consequences that would shape the world for generations to come.
This week in October 1939 was a time of transition, a moment where the world was teetering on the brink of a truly catastrophic conflict.
And the choices that were made during this period, I think, would have a profound impact on the course of the war and the future of the world.
Absolutely. As we move forward in our exploration of World War II, it's crucial to remember the lessons of this pivotal week. It showed how the seeds of global conflict were sown, and how people and nations responded to the unprecedented challenges of their time.
And with that, I think we'll conclude this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us.